She was the first lady who broke all the rules, holding press conferences, fighting racism, and possibly hiding a secret love. But behind the public powerhouse was a woman shaped by loss, silence, and deeply personal bonds. So, what was Eleanor Roosevelt really like when the cameras were off? Stick around, because this story rewrites everything you thought you knew. A childhood of distance and discipline. Eleanor Roosevelt was born on October 11, 1884, into one of New York's wealthiest families. Her family name, Roosevelt, already carried weight in American society, but her personal life was shaped less by privilege and more by emotional isolation. From the outside, she had everything: a grand home, family prestige, and access to elite circles. But inside that world, Eleanor's childhood was cold and lonely. Her father, Elliot Roosevelt, was the younger brother of future President Theodore Roosevelt. He was charming and deeply affectionate toward Eleanor, often calling her his Little Nell. When he was around, he adored her. He gave her handwritten notes, called her beautiful, and made her feel seen. But he struggled with alcoholism and mental health problems, and those issues kept him away more than they brought him close. He'd vanish for long periods, and when he returned, it was usually because he was recovering from another personal crisis. Eleanor clung to those short visits, hoping each one might be the start of something more stable. But they never were. Her mother, Anna Hall Roosevelt, was distant in a different way. She was a striking beauty, well known in New York society for her looks and charm, but she had little warmth for her daughter. Anna often mocked Eleanor's appearance, calling her Granny because of her serious expression and plain face. To a child who already struggled with shyness and self-doubt, those words cut deep. Eleanor grew up believing she was unwanted, even within her own home. That belief followed her for years. When Eleanor was just 8 years old, her mother died of diphtheria. A few months later, her younger brother, Elliot Jr., also died. Then came the final blow. Her father died after jumping from a window during a drinking episode. Eleanor was only 10. In just 2 years, she lost both parents and her brother. She was suddenly an orphan, left with nothing but fragments of a broken family. After their deaths, Eleanor and her remaining brother Hall were sent to live with their grandmother, Mary Ludlow Hall. Her grandmother was strict, religious, and deeply concerned with appearances. She raised Eleanor in a dark and gloomy New York townhouse, where heavy curtains kept out the sun and silence was expected in every room. There was no space for play, laughter, or emotional comfort. Life was rigid, measured, and formal. Her grandmother saw it as her duty to shape Eleanor into a proper lady, one who would reflect well on the Roosevelt name. But the more pressure she applied, the more withdrawn Eleanor became. She was already shy, but now she grew quieter, almost invisible. There were few people Eleanor could rely on. She was surrounded by servants and relatives, but no one truly listened to her. She found comfort in books and journaling. She filled pages with thoughts she couldn't say out loud. In her writing, she processed grief, fear, and confusion, even as she tried to make sense of why the adults around her always seemed disappointed. By the time she was a teenager, Eleanor had developed a quiet, careful way of moving through the world. She was deeply observant and always aware of other people's feelings. Her emotional life became something she guarded closely. She longed for connection, but she didn't know how to ask for it. At social events, she often stood on the edges of rooms, unsure how to join in. When people did speak to her, she tried to please them, hoping they might like her. But deep down, she assumed they wouldn't. Despite the emotional coldness at home, her education became a turning point. At age 15, she was sent to Allenswood Academy, a finishing school near London. There, she met Marie Souvestre, a headmistress who treated Eleanor with respect and intellectual seriousness. Souvestre challenged her to think, read widely, and speak her mind. For the first time, Eleanor felt seen not for who her family was, but for who she was becoming. That experience gave her a small but powerful sense of identity. Still, by the time she returned to New York, Eleanor was caught between two worlds. On one hand, she was expected to marry well and take her place in society. On the other, she was beginning to sense that her life might need something more than titles and appearances, but that part of her would stay hidden for a while. A strategic marriage to Franklin D. Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was just 20 when she married Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1905. They were fifth cousins, both descended from the same wealthy New York family. Their future looked bright, and their union was seen as a match of status, not just emotion. But even at the start, Eleanor had reasons to feel uncertain. Franklin seemed warm, attentive, and familiar, someone she could trust. But his family, especially his mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, had other ideas. Sarah never truly gave up control of her only child. She had financed Franklin's lifestyle and expected to be part of his household even after marriage. And she made good on that. When the couple moved into their New York home, Sarah lived right next door. In fact, she had the house built with a connecting door between their apartments. She came and went as she pleased, offering opinions on how to raise the children, manage the home, and even how Eleanor should behave. Eleanor was quiet and shy at first. She didn't push back. She had been raised to be proper, restrained, and useful, so she tried to play the role of the dutiful wife. She bore 6 children in quick succession, though one died in infancy. She managed the household and raised the children mostly alone, while Franklin began building his political career. But it wasn't a balanced partnership. Sarah kept a tight grip on the home, and Franklin's long absences, whether due to politics or recreation, left Eleanor feeling more like a background figure than a partner. By the time the First World War ended, things had already begun to shift. In 1918, Eleanor discovered something that would split her marriage down the middle. While unpacking Franklin's luggage, she found a packet of love letters, written not to her, but to Lucy Mercer, her social secretary. Eleanor didn't scream or throw things. She confronted Franklin with the truth and told him she wanted a divorce. But divorce wasn't an easy option for someone in their position. Franklin's mother threatened to cut him off financially if he went through with it. His advisors warned that his political future would be ruined. A divorced man, especially one from a prominent family, had no place in high office, at least not in that era. So Franklin asked Eleanor to stay. She agreed, but with terms. The marriage would continue publicly, but in private, it would no longer be a romantic partnership. They would raise their children together and support each other's ambitions, but the emotional and physical connection was gone. From that point forward, Eleanor and Franklin shared a name, a home, and a political life, but not a marriage in the traditional sense. She began spending time away from Franklin's political circle. She took trips alone, built friendships outside their marriage, and started carving out her own identity. The emotional distance between them gave her a kind of freedom she hadn't known before, but still they kept up a united front, especially when Franklin's health started to falter. After he was diagnosed with polio in 1921, Eleanor became more involved in his political work, not because their marriage had healed, but because she had found a new purpose. Stepping into a public role on her own terms. When Franklin was elected president in 1932, people expected her to fade quietly into the background like the first ladies before her. But she had other plans. Even before moving into the White House, Eleanor had been involved in women's reform groups. She gave speeches in church basements and sat in community halls listening to working women talk about pay, safety, and child care. She saw the divide between those in power and those trying to survive the weak. That divide never left her. One of her early passions was education. She taught at the Todhunter School in New York City, a private school for girls focused on independence and critical thinking. Her salary went straight to the school's scholarship fund. In a time when many elite women avoided messy causes, Eleanor stood in front of a chalkboard, teaching girls to form their own opinions and speak their minds. And she didn't stop with classrooms. Eleanor went into overcrowded tenements and factory towns. She worked with the Women's Trade Union League, a group that supported working-class women trying to unionize. She walked picket lines and spoke at union halls. People weren't used to seeing someone from her background show up in person, much less stay and listen. But Eleanor wasn't there to lecture. She was there to understand. And she knew that learning happened faster when you sat with people instead of standing above them. When Franklin took office, Eleanor moved into a role that no First Lady had ever tried before. While her husband was managing the Great Depression, Eleanor carved out a place for herself in the public eye. She held her own press conferences and made one rule clear: only female reporters were invited. That small decision created jobs for women in newsrooms across the country. If they wanted access to the First Lady, they had to hire a woman. That alone changed careers. She used those press briefings to talk about things no other First Lady had touched: housing conditions, racism, workers' rights, and women's access to health care. Her answers weren't vague. She gave real opinions. Eleanor also wrote a daily newspaper column called My Day. It ran 6 days a week and covered everything from public policy to what she saw on a train ride. Millions of Americans read it, and for many, it was the first time they saw someone in power speak directly to them like an equal. She mentioned local strikes, highlighted the struggles of farmers, and sometimes described what she'd eaten for lunch. That blend of personal and political gave people a reason to trust her voice. She even visited coal mines, migrant camps, and overcrowded hospitals. She showed up without advance notice, often to the frustration of officials who didn't want her to see how bad things really were. But she wanted the unfiltered version. She wanted to see it for herself. She brought those stories back to Washington, not as gossip but as evidence. She used them to push for better funding and new programs. People close to the president sometimes tried to downplay her influence, but staff at federal agencies kept noticing that policies seemed to shift after Eleanor visited a site. If she saw a group of disabled veterans living in a moldy barrack, you could bet that someone would be inspecting that barrack a few weeks later, and the budget for improvements would quietly increase. Her role made some people uncomfortable. They accused her of overstepping, of meddling in politics, of drawing too much attention. But Eleanor wasn't concerned with their discomfort. She believed that being silent when you had influence was the same as being complicit, and silence wasn't her style. And as her name began appearing in headlines across the country, so did new friendships, ones that would reshape her personal world just as much as her public one. Her relationship with Lorena Hickok. By the early 1930s, Eleanor Roosevelt was stepping into a public life that was both visible and unpredictable. At the same time, behind the scenes, a deep personal relationship was forming, one that stayed hidden from the public eye for decades. It started with a reporter named Lorena Hickok, known as Hick to her friends. She worked for the Associated Press and had been assigned to cover Eleanor during her husband's first presidential campaign. But what began as a professional assignment turned into something far more personal. As the two women spent more time together, their connection grew quickly. Within months, Eleanor was writing to Hick every day. Over the next 30 years, they exchanged more than 3,000 letters. The tone of those letters wasn't formal or political, it was warm, intimate, and often emotionally charged. In one letter, Eleanor wrote, "I want to put my arms around you and kiss you at the corner of your mouth." Hick responded with similar affection, writing about missing Eleanor's touch and the comfort of her presence. These weren't quick notes about meetings or updates. They were long, thoughtful letters that revealed a level of closeness Eleanor rarely showed anyone else. The letters alone don't tell the full story. Hick made a life-changing decision to leave her job with the Associated Press so she could remain near Eleanor in Washington, D.C. She moved into a bedroom at the White House for a time and later lived in a house just a few blocks away. She also worked informally with the Roosevelts, gathering information about the effects of the Great Depression for the federal government. But her main reason for staying close wasn't professional. It was Eleanor. The two women took private trips together, away from reporters and staff. They stayed in secluded cottages or borrowed homes along the coast. These weren't political retreats or official visits. They were quiet escapes. Eleanor often looked forward to these getaways, saying she could finally breathe and think when she was alone with Hick. Historians still debate whether the relationship was romantic in the modern sense, but Eleanor's own words leave little doubt about the intensity of her feelings. The relationship didn't fit neatly into the public image of a First Lady. It didn't match what people expected from someone in her position. But it was real, and it lasted decades. There were times when the distance between them caused friction. Eleanor's schedule was demanding. She was traveling constantly, hosting events, giving speeches, and keeping up appearances in a very public marriage. But still, they kept returning to each other. Even after tensions rose, Eleanor kept writing. Her letters remained steady, affectionate, and filled with small details from her days. Despite the emotional weight of their relationship, Eleanor never made it part of her public life. She kept her distance in front of others, avoided direct mention in speeches, and never allowed the press to catch even a glimpse of their private time together. That discretion was necessary. The world wasn't ready to understand what Eleanor and Hick shared, but behind closed doors, the letters kept coming. Their connection endured through the Great Depression, World War II, and the final years of Eleanor's life. Even as Eleanor's circle widened and she formed new friendships, Hick remained in the background, never quite gone, never fully replaced. The emotional depth between them didn't fade, even when they were apart for long stretches of time. By the time historians began publishing their letters decades later, the nature of their relationship sparked new questions about Eleanor Roosevelt's private identity. But during her lifetime, few ever suspected the full story. It remained one of the most carefully guarded parts of her life. Only the people closest to her, and Hick herself, understood the quiet bond that shaped so much of her private world. But Hickok wasn't the only woman who held a lasting place in Eleanor's life. Beyond their bond, a close circle of trusted women quietly shaped her thinking and nourished her inner world. Quiet influence of her women friends. Esther Lepe and Nancy Cook weren't household names, but in Eleanor's world, they were steady anchors. Their advice and insight helped her sort through big ideas about healthcare, education, and the role of government in people's lives. Esther Lepe, a political reformer and public health advocate, had a calm, steady presence that grounded Eleanor. She was sharp, well-read, and always ready with research to back up her views. Nancy Cook brought a practical touch. She handled logistics, kept schedules, and made sure things got done. Together, they gave Eleanor a space where she could think freely and speak without a filter. These were the kinds of women Eleanor chose to keep close, ones who challenged her and kept her thinking. They often retreated to Val Kill, a simple stone cottage in upstate New York. There, away from public eyes, they could speak openly about policies, reforms, and the challenges women faced across the country. Eleanor wasn't just looking for comfort. She used these moments to test ideas, gather feedback, and form opinions she would later bring into national conversations. At Val Kill, weekends weren't about resting, they were about planning. Guests included reformers, educators, union organizers, and writers. Some were famous, others weren't. The real draw was the freedom to speak honestly. The living room often turned into a meeting room. Over home-cooked meals and fireside chats, Eleanor and her guests worked through real problems: how to get better health care into rural towns, how to improve school access, and how to protect workers' rights. Ideas that seemed radical in Washington felt practical when discussed at the cottage. These friendships were more than personal. They helped her grow. In a world where men held most of the power, Eleanor created her own system of influence. She leaned on these women for advice she could trust. They had lived through war, illness, and poverty. Their opinions came from experience, not theory. Eleanor took that seriously. Even when she returned to Washington, these relationships didn't fade. She wrote letters constantly. Some were practical, updates on bills or programs. Others were deeply personal. In one letter to Esther, she admitted she was tired but couldn't stop working. That inner pressure to keep going didn't come from Franklin or party politics. It came from herself and the expectations she knew her friends had for her. When Franklin became president, Eleanor found herself in a strange position. She had more visibility than ever, but not much formal power. That didn't stop her. While the press tracked her travels and criticized her speeches, she stayed grounded through her friendships. At one point, reporters mocked her for spending time in upstate New York with a group of ladies. Eleanor didn't respond. But soon after, she publicly supported a rural health care bill that had roots in those very same gatherings. The women at Val Kill weren't always in agreement. They argued, pushed back, and debated every detail. Eleanor didn't want polite nods, she wanted honesty. That's why their advice mattered more to her than most cabinet members. They told her when she was off the mark. They helped her fine-tune ideas before they became national headlines. That kind of steady energy didn't go unnoticed. Her mail was full of questions: how to start a community program, how to write to your congressman, how to stand up for your rights. People trusted her voice because they sensed it came from real effort, not polished speeches. And it didn't stop at domestic issues. Those same habits carried into her next phase when she began stepping onto the world stage. A voice in war and global politics. While most first ladies kept their roles ceremonial during wartime, Eleanor Roosevelt booked a flight to the front lines. In August 1943, she visited Allied forces in the South Pacific, becoming the First Lady to enter an active combat zone. The military wasn't prepared for it. Some generals tried to talk her out of it. But Eleanor insisted and showed up with her notebook in hand and questions ready. Her trip wasn't just for morale. She met with military doctors, wounded soldiers, chaplains, and commanders. Every base she stopped at, she asked what the troops needed. Then she took those answers straight back to Washington. She typed her own notes and filed them with the White House without delay. Some reports were kept quiet, but insiders said her summaries were clear, direct, and sharp. She didn't just observe, she made sure someone listened. By the time she left the Pacific, commanders were calling her visits more effective than a dozen morale officers. Soldiers lined up for hours just to shake her hand. She visited nearly 50 locations in under 5 weeks, sometimes flying on rough planes with no insulation and sleeping on army cots. In Australia, she gave speeches to crowded halls, answered press questions without scripts, and stayed up late writing her My Day column. She still mailed it back home every morning. Even though her public image remained warm and approachable behind closed doors, she was asking questions that caught the attention of senior staff. How many soldiers were being discharged for mental health reasons? Why weren't certain bases desegregated? Was there a policy for following up on wounded veterans after they returned home? She took detailed notes, and her follow-ups weren't optional. While the public followed her travels through newspaper clippings and radio updates, heads of state took her visits seriously. In New Zealand, she met with top officials to discuss military coordination and civilian support systems. In Australia, she dined with generals and cabinet members. She asked how the United States could better support them. Her questions weren't filtered, and her opinions didn't always match official talking points, but she earned respect for doing her homework. Back in Washington, some in the administration were uneasy. They hadn't approved half of her itinerary. She skipped diplomatic formalities and spoke directly to people in charge. Her husband, President Roosevelt, didn't always know her schedule in advance, but she kept him updated, usually with her handwritten notes. Their marriage had its quiet separations, but when it came to war strategy, Eleanor knew how to deliver feedback that mattered. During her travels, Eleanor also noticed how women were handling wartime responsibilities. From nurses in military hospitals to women working in aircraft hangars, she asked what they needed to do their jobs better. When she returned, she pushed for expanded roles for women in federal wartime programs. Some of those ideas ended up in formal policy shifts within 6 months. But she didn't stop at the Pacific. In the final years of the war, Eleanor represented the U.S. in wartime visits to the U.K. and parts of Europe. In England, she toured bombed neighborhoods and met with Churchill. In France, she walked through damaged towns and met with refugees. She asked about rebuilding plans and sent her notes directly to American agencies handling foreign aid. By the end of the war, Eleanor Roosevelt had taken her place among the most active and informed political figures of the Roosevelt administration. Even without an official uniform, she had shown up in places where no one expected to see her and made herself impossible to ignore. But her growing influence didn't come without resistance. Even within her own party, Eleanor often found herself at odds with powerful voices, especially when her conscience demanded she speak out. Tensions within her own party. While the rest of the Democratic Party tiptoed around the issue of race, she went headfirst into the most divisive territory of all, segregation. Southern Democrats were a powerful bloc at the time, and many of them saw her as a threat. She didn't wait for permission to challenge their views. She did it directly, often in front of cameras and crowds, fully aware of the risks to her reputation and her husband's political alliances. During Franklin's presidency, Eleanor often acted independently. She spoke out when others stayed silent. One of her earliest and loudest stances came during the push for anti-lynching legislation. She backed the Wagner-Costigan bill, which aimed to make lynching a federal crime. Southern lawmakers were furious. Some accused her of tearing the party apart. Others threatened to boycott her appearances. She still kept showing up. She still kept writing. She still kept talking about it. Her push wasn't just symbolic. She took real steps, attending hearings, writing editorials, and applying pressure on party leaders. She challenged Franklin directly on the issue. He refused to back the bill publicly, worried it would cost him support in the South. Eleanor didn't hide her disappointment. She told reporters that silence made the government complicit. She didn't pretend to agree with his political caution. Their split on this issue played out in newspapers across the country. Eleanor wasn't just speaking from a podium or writing from a desk. She made it personal. She invited civil rights activists to the White House, often against the advice of her husband's advisors. One of the most memorable moments came in 1939. Marian Anderson, a black opera singer, had been denied permission to perform at Constitution Hall by the Daughters of the American Revolution because of her race. Eleanor resigned from the organization in protest. She then worked behind the scenes to organize a new venue, an outdoor concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. On Easter Sunday, Anderson sang before 75,000 people, and millions more heard her on the radio. Eleanor sat proudly in the front row. That wasn't a one-time event. She repeatedly used her access and influence to create space for Black Americans in political conversations. At a time when many civil rights activists were shut out of national discussions, Eleanor kept them close. She often met privately with leaders like Walter White of the NAACP and educator Mary McLeod Bethune, who later became one of her closest friends and advisors. Eleanor didn't treat these meetings as formalities. She wanted advice, perspective, and guidance, and she acted on it. Eleanor's public fights often caused problems for Franklin. She knew it. So did he. Their disagreements were sometimes aired publicly. She once criticized one of his policy choices just days after he made it. Party leaders feared she was giving Republicans ammunition. Voters didn't always know what to make of it. But her independence had its own appeal. People who didn't trust politicians still trusted her. She wasn't running for office, which gave her the freedom to say what elected officials couldn't. She used that space well. When members of the party told her to stop pushing the race issue, she responded by writing more columns and showing up at more events. Her critics accused her of dividing the party, but Eleanor saw it another way. She believed ignoring injustice was the real threat. By the early 1940s, party tensions had reached a boiling point. Southern Democrats openly campaigned against her. They called her dangerous. They mocked her in speeches and editorials. Cartoons painted her as a meddler, a traitor, even a menace. She didn't care. She kept moving forward. She spoke at black colleges, visited segregated hospitals, and pushed military officials to integrate the armed forces. Her presence alone often caused a stir, but that was part of the point. Despite all these political clashes, Eleanor's commitment to justice only deepened. After Franklin's death in 1945, she carried that same conviction onto the world stage through her groundbreaking work at the United Nations. Leading work at the United Nations. In 1945, President Truman asked her to join the very first United States delegation to the United Nations. At the time, the United Nations was still finding its footing. The world had just come out of a war that left millions dead and countries broken. Leaders from across the globe were trying to figure out how to prevent it from happening again. Eleanor was one of the few women sitting at the table. Most thought she'd be quiet. She wasn't. Eleanor was quickly placed on the United Nations Human Rights Commission. It wasn't just a title. She became the chair of the committee tasked with writing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This was no easy job. The members were from countries with totally different legal systems, beliefs, and political goals. But they all had to agree on a single document that would lay the foundation for how people everywhere should be treated. The meetings were long. The arguments were constant. Some countries wanted soft language. Others wanted loopholes. But Eleanor didn't let up. She pushed for strong words on equality, freedom of speech, and the right to live free from fear. When others tried to compromise on key points, she stepped in with calm but firm resistance. She reminded the group of what had just happened during the war and why this document couldn't be vague. She worked closely with people like René Cassin from France, Charles Malik from Lebanon, and Peng Chun Chang from China. These were sharp minds with strong opinions. But Eleanor earned their respect not by overpowering them, but by listening carefully and speaking clearly. When tensions flared, she had a way of cooling the room down without backing off from what she believed was right. One of her most difficult tasks was balancing the politics of the Cold War. The Soviet Union didn't want to support a declaration that included freedoms they didn't allow in their own country. The U.S. and its allies pushed hard for individual rights. Eleanor had to find a path that would keep the committee moving without watering down the core message. She often had private talks with members after hours, working behind the scenes to build trust and calm suspicion. The final draft wasn't perfect, but it was groundbreaking. It covered civil and political rights like freedom of expression, religion, and fair trials. It also included social and economic rights, like access to education, housing, and health care. Eleanor made sure those parts stayed in, even when others pushed to remove them. To her, it wasn't about charity or politics, it was about dignity. When the Declaration was presented to the full United Nations General Assembly in December 1948, Eleanor stood to speak. She laid out the purpose of the document with simple, clear words. She didn't talk like a diplomat. She spoke like someone who understood how power, injustice, and fear could shape a life, and how rules on paper could make the difference between safety and suffering. The vote passed with 48 countries in favor and none opposed. 8 countries abstained, mostly from the Soviet bloc. But that didn't lessen the moment. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights became one of the most important documents in modern history. Eleanor's name was all over it, even if it wasn't printed on the page. Her work didn't stop after the vote. She traveled to other countries to promote the Declaration and pressure governments to adopt its principles. She visited refugee camps, met with local leaders, and spoke in small halls and large parliaments. People listened, not just because she was a Roosevelt, but because she knew how to connect big ideas to real life. This chapter of her life made her more than a first lady. It placed her on the world stage as a defender of human dignity, at a time when the world was still healing. And through it all, she kept working the same way she always had. Final years and lasting private correspondence. Even in her final decade, Eleanor Roosevelt didn't slow down much. Even as her health began to shift, she still traveled, spoke at events, and met with students, politicians, and activists who came to her for advice. Some came for encouragement. Others came with complicated problems. Eleanor rarely turned them away. She had spent her life surrounded by pressure, and by this point she could cut through most situations with a simple observation or question. She stayed in touch with many of them through letters. That habit had always been part of her routine, but it became more focused in her later years. Her letters didn't carry slogans or rehearsed lines. They were personal and specific. She wrote in longhand, often late at night or early in the morning. In one letter, she encouraged a young woman to accept a government position, reminding her that self-doubt wasn't a reason to hold back. In another, she carefully questioned a young man's plan to abandon public service, urging him not to give up too soon. The tone of her correspondence shifted slightly as she aged. There was more reflection, less urgency. She looked back on decisions with clarity but didn't romanticize them. She admitted regrets and second-guessed some calls but refused to act like a victim of her circumstances. She still believed in personal responsibility and self-direction, even when her body began to resist her will. Her public life didn't fade either. She kept a regular writing schedule and continued her My Day column almost until the end. That column, which she had started during her time as First Lady, became a kind of diary in plain sight. She wrote about travel, politics, books, public figures, and even her daily walks. Some entries were casual, others more thoughtful, but there was always something beneath the surface, an effort to stay connected, to stay useful. Even when doctors asked her to slow down, she kept most of her commitments. She gave speeches across the country and responded to interview requests. Her voice was lower and her walk slower, but she remained fully engaged in world affairs. She weighed in on the state of civil rights, women's roles in politics, and international cooperation. At one event, she stood on stage for nearly an hour, answering audience questions without notes. Back at home, her apartment in Manhattan remained a quiet but active space. There were piles of mail, stacks of books, and vases of fresh flowers. Visitors often found her seated near a window surrounded by reading glasses, handwritten notes, and clippings. She had a radio she listened to every morning and a small typewriter she used for first drafts. Friends dropped by unannounced, and she usually welcomed them with warm tea and a sharp question about what they were currently working on. Her granddaughter often visited on weekends. Eleanor shared stories from her childhood and showed her favorite books. They sometimes baked simple desserts or played card games. These were not grand moments, but they meant something. Eleanor understood the value of time, especially toward the end. In private, she began preparing her archives. She sorted letters, wrote captions, and decided what to keep. She wanted future researchers to see her clearly, not as a myth or symbol. She knew how easy it was to reduce a person to a label, and she didn't want that for herself. So she left behind full files, unedited notes, and pages of conversations that most people never knew had taken place. Her health finally began to slip in 1962. She had been diagnosed with a rare form of tuberculosis in the bone marrow and spent several weeks in the hospital. Friends visited often, and family gathered closely. Even in her hospital bed, she dictated letters. One nurse recalled that she corrected the grammar on her own prescription chart. When she returned home for the last time, she asked to see a few of her close companions one-on-one. She died quietly on November 7, 1962, in her New York apartment. Her doctor, family members, and a few old friends were nearby. The room was quiet. On the bedside table were several books, a half-filled journal, and 2 opened letters. In the days that followed, newspapers printed tributes and headlines, but much of what mattered stayed off the page. What endured were the private words she wrote to people no one else would remember. Notes about courage, warnings against apathy, gentle nudges, bold truths. If you found her journey as powerful as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more untold stories of remarkable lives. Let us know in the comments, which part of Eleanor's legacy inspired you the most?